We'll go. All right. Welcome to Talking Capitalism. Today, we are sitting with Dr. Chris Hurl, who is an associate professor in sociology and anthropology. He's a political economist trained at the infamous Institute of Political Economy at Carleton University, and one of my old grad school buds, although that's not the only reason why we are talking with Dr. Hurl today, I assure you. Chris, welcome to the show. And I was hoping that by way of introducing yourself, you could tell us a little bit about you and how you've come to understand capitalism in the run of your life and the run of your work.
Okay, yeah, and thanks for having me, AJ. It's a great idea to put together a program like this. Gives me ideas for my classes, so I hope this will be beneficial for the students. In terms of how I got interested in capitalism, it's actually a great segue into our topic for discussion today, because what happened was I was an undergrad student in '97, which kind of dates me a little bit, the roaring '90s. So, and I was at the University of British Columbia, my first year of university. And I remember the first day of class, I just saw all these posters everywhere saying "fuck APEC" and calling people to organize action. And I was like, APEC, what's that? What's that all about? And there was a very active kind of movement kind of bubbling around UBC at the time. And there was a group of students, faculty that were organizing opposition to this meeting that was going to be held at UBC in '97 of the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, that is APEC. And the aim of APEC was to move towards free trade between Canada and other countries around the kind of Pacific Rim. And there was a lot of concern about the ramifications for that, especially with dictatorships in some countries where there were sweatshops being kind of organized, no labor standards, no environmental standards. There was a concern with Canada supporting these kinds of dictatorships, with being complicit in their human rights abuses, as well as the concern that it might provoke a race to the bottom where manufacturing jobs in Canada would then go to these countries without labor standards, environmental standards, and that would lead Canada to start deindustrializing, losing jobs here. So I wasn't really quite sure about any of this at the time, but it got me interested. And then if you Google search APEC 1997, you'll see what happened. There was a big standoff with the police. It turned into a larger kind of protest movement. And I just kind of got wrapped up in it, kind of moving into a whole series of protests around this issue around free trade with the World Trade Organization in '99, the Free Trade of the Agreement of the Americas in 2001. And so my concern at that time was that these kinds of trade agreements, this kind of economic order that was being established, would ultimately kind of gut any kinds of government regulations, protections around the environment, protections around labor that we would have, and lead to a kind of a race to the bottom where we would gut our regulations in order to stay competitive with other countries, and other countries would be doing the same. And in the end, that would just free capital to be able to do whatever it wants.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, I remember in the late '90s, it was, oftentimes in the discourses, people were talking about how it was the end of the state, and just, borders aren't supposed to mean anything, and like fly on state regulation about anything. So yeah, it's really cool to hear a little bit about the organizing around the '90s, which then I think leads nicely into the subject of our discussion today, which is about the particular organizing against the original Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and the lovely website that you shared with us. maybe you could reflect a little bit about like where free trade agreements fit in the kind of broader history of capitalism, because it seems to me that they don't really exist. We've had preferential trade agreements for some time, but really the idea of the free trade agreement kind of is indicative of the neoliberal rise. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about your project and sort of why people in Canada were opposed to the rise of free trade between Canada and the United States.
Yeah, well, and I think a free trade is connected to a longer tradition under capitalism, which some people refer to as kind of a laissez-faire kind of capitalism, where you kind of leave the market to its own devices, right? And the idea is if we don't regulate things, if the government doesn't interfere in the market, then the market will function optimally, right? And there's been just a long history of opposition to that idea. Since the 19th century, people have challenged this idea that we should just leave the market to its own devices and question whether that will lead to optimal results. And people have called for different forms of organizing, different kinds of orders, arrangements, regulations, recognizing that the market is fundamentally a social product and it should be socially regulated in some way, right? So in a way, the movement that emerged in the 80s was kind of building from that and building, more particularly, it was building from the movements of the 60s and 70s. A lot of the foundations for the struggle against free trade emerged then. But kind of from the 80s onwards, there was a real push by the kind of political right in Canada, the United States, the UK, other countries. After the 60s and 70s, when we had a welfare state, we established healthcare, other kinds of social security, right? Kind of coming out of the 70s, there was a crisis, and in response to that crisis, the kind of conservative movement pushed to start deregulating things again, right? Deregulating the market, getting rid of social security, getting rid of government intervention in the market, right? And free trade was a part of this. The free trade movement was a push to kind of start minimizing different kinds of regulations, different forms of state kind of regulation that had been in place, kind of governing the flow of imports and exports around the world, right? And replacing it with an economic order that would enable the free flow of capital, right, to different places with minimal kind of opportunities for intervention on the part of a kind of a political democratic opposition. I mean, it's often thought wrongly, I think, that this was a period where people were pushing the minimization of state intervention in the market. And especially in the early years in the 80s, but really, I think it's just been pushing and promoting a different kind of state intervention, a different kind of economic order. And really, our project, the Free Trade Activist History Project, what we're doing is we're kind of documenting the early struggles. Probably students in your class, they might not be familiar with the fact that free trade was the issue that defines the 1988 federal elections. And elections are often organized around a range of different issues that come into play. Seldom single issue kind of elections, but in the context of 88, it was a single issue in part because of the political opposition to free trade. So what our website does is we're kind of documenting the early struggles before I got into it, before 97. What happened was, we started talking to people about this, older people that have been involved in these struggles for a long time. And we realized that their stories just hadn't been documented, and people have forgotten this history, that there was this kind of huge struggle around these kinds of economic issues at that time. So what we've been trying to do with the website is just help to kind of remember this and remember just how big that moment was and how it really kind of laid the foundation for the struggles, the political organizing that took place through the 90s and early 2000s, and in many ways kind of laid the foundation for where we are now.
Nice. I mean, yeah, that's so important. I mean, like just capturing the oral history, documenting it for future study, like in and of itself is such a Herculean task, and it's so awesome that this is going to be there. Like, I mean, students in this class will certainly be engaging with this archive, maybe even writing their term papers about this subject and this fight. So it's really exciting. Thank you for your work in organizing it. It kind of got me thinking, like, not to any way minimize it, but just because I was getting excited, like listening to you talk about this, and then remembering in the 90s, that Rage Against the Machine song where they say, who controls the past now controls the future, and who controls the future controls the present, or something like that. And it just got, like, if we don't tell these stories, if we can't control the narratives or to actually reflect what actually happened from the point of view of people who experienced it, we really have no hope of telling an accurate history. So,
yeah. The other part of it that would be of interest to your class is the fact that really what happened with the 88 elections specifically was that the thing that was on trial, the single issue that was on trial in 88 more than any issue was capitalism. It was the economic order, right? And at the time, people all over the country were having debates around free trade. People in their households, in their communities, right? Mm-hmm. They were talking about economics and what the economic order should be, right? So there was a real kind of popularization of different understandings of economics and economy at the time, and also a kind of there was a normative kind of connotation to the economy in terms of thinking about what kind of economy we want, what our economy should be, and there was a sense of agency that we could make our economy a lot of different things, which I think is really important to remember as well, because often we don't feel that way in elections, right?
That's right. Or even just feel that way in relation to our economy. The idea that we get to actually decide and shape the nature and values of the economy that we live in. Like, it's such an important thing. Like, I'm looking at your timeline here and seeing June 12th, the Let Canadians Decide Day of Action. What an awesome opportunity to actually try and bring people across the country together to actually have a conversation about what you want your economy to look like, instead of the one that you're just going to receive.
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting about this movement is, like, thinking you should see just like how many different groups were involved in the struggle and how diverse the opposition was, because, like, you would imagine that the key players here would be labor, of course, like labor unions, right, opposed to free trade. And yes, they were active in the movement at the time. There was a lot of concern that that this kind of agreement would lead to deindustrialization, and in many cases that was the consequence. Like, a lot of factory jobs moved from Canada to other parts of the world as a result of the free trade kind of agenda. But labor wasn't really the most active kind of opponent to free trade at the time. And in fact, labor was quite divided, because at the time, many labor unions were headquartered in the United States, and there was an ambivalence about, well, maybe this would be good for our membership, right? There were labor unions that were heavily kind of opposed to free trade. We think about the public sector unions. Another group was the international garment workers, which were women, largely immigrants. They were some of the first movers against free trade at the time. And people don't really, might not think that this was a gendered and racialized issue, but it very much was. And with immigrant women kind of leading the charge, and some of the most active people in this movement were actually feminists coming from women's organizations, and not as much from labor organizations. So the NAC, the National Action Coalition for the Status of Women, for example, they were one of the major people that set in motion this movement. And in fact, their meetings were held in the NAC headquarters, often for the coalitions that were organized, right? And they brought together not just labor, but there was church organizations. All of the major churches were opposed to free trade at the time. Motivated by liberation theology, there was a powerful movement emerging at the time. Environmental movements were organizing against free trade. There was a concern that by signing these agreements, we would relinquish our ability to adopt labor regulations to help decarbonize our economy. The AFN, the Assembly of First Nations, were part of this coalition. They were in the middle of fighting the government for recognition and their ability to have control over their territories. There was concern with free trade that would make it easier for outside corporations to take control of their territories without their consent, right? So this was more than just a labor issue. It was a larger issue. And in the 90s, the people started referring to it as a movement of movements because it was an issue that so many different groups from so many different sectors were concerned about, and it brought them together.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's fast. And you can see like how it's never really stopped. It's changed forms as different challenges emerge. But I mean, we could talk for hours about this, Chris, but I did promise you 15 minutes. So just as by saying thanks and by saying goodbye, I was wondering if you had maybe one key takeaway that first year students who are studying capitalism, maybe for the first time, hopefully not the last time, what should they keep in mind if they forget everything else that they learn in this class? What should they remember?
That's a good question. I think the thing to remember is that capitalism isn't just an economic order, it's an order that's politically instituted. And there are major struggles over how capitalism has been politically instituted. And I think it's often easy to forget about those struggles. Gary Kidsman talks about how we live in a society which where we experience the social organization of forgetting, right? Like where it's easy to forget these struggles and to recognize just how much impact they had on our society. And it's very important, I think, to kind of come back to these struggles to recognize how the political institution of capitalism has always been contested. It continues to be contested. And if we speak to kind of the older generations, people in our community, about how they have organized around this stuff, we have a lot to learn from them. And I encourage people to check out the interviews on the website because there's so much to learn from the experiences that people had kind of organizing against this stuff.
All right. Thank you so much. We have been talking capitalism with Dr. Chris Hurl from Concordia University. Thanks so much, and we'll catch the rest of you next time.